Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. And first off, we have a big milestone to celebrate, 1,000 subscribers. It's been a long journey and very haphazard to say the least. I've been here for 7 years making videos, but not like you'd really know it because myself and the channel have changed so much along the way. So to those subscribers who've stuck around, thank you. And to those who've recently joined, I can't wait to share some more as we head further into 2021. Ideally, I'd love to create a community and have us all share our knowledge together as we grow along the way, and I've been really humbled by everyone's response to my latest videos so far. So thank you so much. And having said that, please consider subscribing if you'd like to be a part of this, and thank you again for everyone's support. Having said all that, I'm now going to riff on myself for making some silly decisions in the hope that I can also prevent you from doing the same. Because that's the best way to learn, right? Through other people's mistakes. Now, hindsight is an incredible thing. We all love to think we saw it coming or it was obvious looking back, but in this case, that's totally what happened to me. I just missed the obvious. You see, when I was putting together my latest camera purchase, which involved two new Sony bodies, the a7S III and the FX6, I knew I had to invest in some new lenses too. Adapting my Canon glass just didn't feel right, and for the type of work I do, autofocus is an amazing asset to have. So I began to investigate replacements for my two main staples, the 24-70 and the 70-200, which covers most of what I need for my regular shoots. Starting with the 24-70, I decided to eliminate third-party options out of the decision pretty quickly. Don't get me wrong, the Sigma 24-70 looked like a great option, and it was much cheaper compared with the Sony 24-70, but my experience with Sigma hasn't been great. I'm sure the image quality would have been excellent, like most people have said, but there were some big questions around autofocus performance which I simply couldn't find the answers to online. Things like how loud, fast, and whether there was stepping involved when the lens shifted focus. The Tamron option seemed like another great alternative, but the 28mm rather than the 24mm really bugged me because that wide part of the lens is really important when trying to capture a location. 4mm doesn't sound like a lot, but already 24mm is often too far zoomed in when you're in tight environments. So in the end, my options came down to the Sony 24-70 G Master or the Sony 24-105G, and I decided on the latter. Yes, it's only f4 in comparison to the 24-70, which is an f2.8, but I knew the longer extension to 105mm would come in handy, as well as the image stabilization on the FX6, which has no IBIS like the a7S III. Both of these Sony cameras are also full frame as well, so I knew that the depth of field rendered on the sensor is effectively the equivalent to one more stop when compared to a Super 35 sensor. Therefore, that f4 only really matters for the amount of light being let into the sensor and not necessarily for the depth of field aspect. But thankfully, both of these cameras are also really good in low light, and for most of my shoots so far, I'm rarely ever needing to go past ISO 1250 in lit environments. Honestly, the 24-105 is such a versatile lens that I could recommend it to anyone using these cameras for videos. The range it covers makes this lens like a Swiss Army knife, and the image stabilization is really handy to have for the FX6. The 24-70 is a good lens, but it's heavier and more expensive and covering less of a focal distance. I still think it's a good option, and personally, if you're only using on an a7S III, the f2.8 aperture is nicer when it comes to creating separation from subjects and backgrounds. For me, rather than going for this lens, my next purchase is most likely a 16-35mm f2.8, therefore covering me from 16mm all the way to 200mm with 3 lenses. I also think it's handy to have the 16-35mm for gimbal work because the range overlaps with the 24-105mm. On a couple of recent shoots, I was actually hot swapping the 24-105 back and forth from the a7S, which was on the gimbal, and the FX6, which was handheld, and obviously that can really slow you down over the course of a day. But let's move on to the 70-200, because that's when my decision making starts to suffer from a lack of critical thinking. You see, 2019 was a big year for filming corporate events, and 2020 was a little quieter on that front. No idea why. So the fact that I felt so eager to jump on a 70-200 was also a little questionable, seeing as this lens is mainly a specialty lens, which I used a lot when shooting events. I opted for the f2.8 because that's the exact equivalent I was replacing from my Canon side of things, and I didn't want to feel as though I was downgrading by going for the f4. The only problem is this lens has stayed relatively fresh in its included case since I purchased it because I haven't filmed any live events. Go figure. To be honest, I could have saved myself a lot of money going for the f4 version because, as we spoke about before, both of these cameras can do really well with lower exposures, and the depth of field on a full frame would be the equivalent to an f2.8 on a Super 35 sensor anyway. Not only that, I could have saved myself even more by not buying it in the first place. And this goes to the core of a lot of videos about gear, which should always ask, do you really need this, and will you use it? I have no doubt this lens will come in handy at some point in the future, but once you've converted your hard-earned dollars into a product, it becomes a depreciating paperweight unless you're out there using it to earn you even more dollars. But I'll come back to what I should have done at the end of this video. Finally, luxury purchases don't get much better than the 85mm f1.4. If I shot portraits, I would adore this lens with its razor-thin f1.4 aperture and very flattering focal length. It's a beautiful, bulky, and pricey lens, which in my head I justified by saying it'd be great for talking heads. The minimal focus distance is a bit of a challenge and means it isn't really a close-up or detail-focused lens. It also hasn't seen as much use as the 24-105mm and is quite specialized depending on what you need it for. However, I don't regret any of these purchases. All of these lenses will get more use as this year goes on, I know it. Even if these corporate events don't return, the 70-200mm is very handy for covering weddings from a distance and interviews as the close-up lens on a subject. The 85mm will be a little bit more specialized, but honestly it's my favorite focal length and I'm gonna find some more opportunities to use it in my projects given the amazing separation it can produce with that f1.4 aperture. But for those mainly working in corporate video production, building a kit of Sony lenses, my advice is as follows. The 24-105mm is a great lens and a perfect pairing with the Sony FX6. Don't let the f4 keep you from getting it unless you're always working in very low light conditions. The extra 35mm on the long end has served me really well, and I've seen some very good feedback from other FX6 users who have this lens as well. The quality of the glass itself is more than good enough for this kind of work, but if you're always on the telephoto side, I would potentially switch over to the 70-200 instead, as the quality is better with that lens on the equivalent focal length. On that note, the 70-200 f2.8 is also a really nice lens. It's hefty, like all of them are, but the quality and the f2.8 aperture make it great for talking heads and events when they return. I will say though, given the price tag for this one, definitely check out the f4 version. I can't say much about it myself because I haven't looked at it yet, but the cost savings might be the right trade-off depending on what you do. Going back, I would have utilized that $3,000 to put into a 16-35mm in the meantime, and potentially a 35mm prime as well. I still think I would have needed a 70-200 at some point, but make sure you know what your work mainly consists of and where your money will be most well utilized in the present, not in the future. Finally, if you have the cash for one prime lens, the 35mm has to be the smartest choice for a lot of people. It's wide enough to be more useful in more situations, and having a fast aperture if you go for the f1.8 or now the f1.4 G Master would give you enough separation to use it for interviews too. The 85mm on the other hand, which I purchased, is more specialized and I'd only recommend it if you shoot a lot of close-ups of talking heads. But if you know you need an 85mm, the Sony G Master is a beautiful piece of glass. If you're unsure, save the money. That was definitely an emotional purchase for me. And that's gonna wrap it up for this video. I hope this helps some of you looking to get into the Sony ecosystem. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like. And if you're enjoying the content, it's actually free to subscribe. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to know more about any of these lenses, and I'll see you in the next one.